I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd give an ultimatum about a wedding, but here I am. To understand how things got to this point, I need to go back a bit. Because this isn't just about wedding planning, this is about my parents. Growing up, I had what people from the outside would probably consider a normal family, but it wasn't. It was far from it. My parents were manipulative, controlling, and frankly toxic. They were the kind of parents who had to be in charge of every decision I made, no matter how small. Even as I grew older, they never loosened the reins. If I tried to push back or assert myself, it would turn into a situation where they made me feel like I was the one in the wrong, like I was ungrateful or disrespectful. This behavior only intensified as I reached adulthood, and by the time I moved out, we were barely on speaking terms. A few years ago, after one particularly heated argument where they crossed a major line, bringing up some personal failures and blaming me for everything wrong in their lives, I made the decision to cut ties. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my own mental health. For years, I've had minimal contact with them. I would send the occasional text on birthdays and holidays, but that was it. I didn't visit, didn't call, didn't engage. That's just how it had to be if I wanted to live my life on my own terms, without their constant interference. Fast forward to a few months ago, when I proposed to my fiancée, Emma. Our relationship has always been strong. We've always been good at resolving our differences, small arguments, disagreements about things like household chores or what movie to watch were quickly forgotten. Emma has always been patient and understanding, and I've never had any reason to doubt our compatibility, at least not until the wedding planning started. At first, everything seemed to be going well. We discussed guest lists, venues, and all the usual stuff that comes with planning a wedding. But then, one night over dinner, Emma brought up the idea of inviting my parents. I was a bit surprised. She knew about my strained relationship with them. I hadn't hidden anything from her. In fact, I'd told her the whole story about why I didn't want them involved in my life. So when she mentioned inviting them, I was caught off guard. "Do you think you'll regret not having them there?" she asked, and I could tell from her tone that she genuinely thought this might be important. I didn't react immediately. Instead, I explained again why I didn't want them there. I told her how they'd always treated me, how our relationship was broken beyond repair, and how inviting them would just bring unnecessary stress into our lives on a day that was supposed to be about us. I thought she'd understand. But the conversation didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, the topic came up again. Each time, Emma seemed a bit more insistent. She thought that maybe this could be an opportunity for reconciliation, a chance to mend fences, as she put it. I, on the other hand, saw it as reopening old wounds. At first, I tried to explain that my parents wouldn't change just because they were invited to a wedding. They've had years to make amends, and they haven't. I reminded Emma of the countless times I'd tried to meet them halfway, only for them to manipulate and guilt-trip me in return. But she didn't seem to get it. She kept brushing off my concerns, saying that weddings were about family and that it wouldn't feel right if my parents weren't there. This is where things started to shift between us. Our normally easygoing conversations turned into small arguments. It wasn't just about the guest list anymore. It was about a fundamental difference in how we viewed family. Emma came from a close-knit family where disagreements were quickly smoothed over and everyone was expected to be there for big life events. My experience was the opposite. For me, family had been a source of pain, not comfort. The more we talked, the more I realized that Emma genuinely believed she was helping by pushing for my parents' inclusion. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She honestly thought this could be good for me. But to me, it felt like she was ignoring everything I'd told her about how toxic they were. The final straw came one evening when we were sitting on the couch, going over the guest list again. Emma circled back to the topic of my parents, and this time she didn't just suggest inviting them, she insisted. She said that we couldn't get married without them being there, that it was too important to leave them out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything I'd explained, she was still pushing for this. That's when I snapped. "I can't marry you if you keep insisting on this," I said, maybe more harshly than I intended. Emma froze. I think that was the last thing she expected me to say. But I wasn't bluffing. I couldn't see a future where we got married if she couldn't respect my boundaries on this. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about the kind of partnership we were going to have. The room was silent after I said it. Emma looked at me like she didn't recognize the person sitting next to her. I could see the shock and hurt in her eyes, but I didn't take it back. I couldn't. And that's where we are now. I don't know what's going to happen next. Emma hasn't said much since that night. She's still processing, and honestly, so am I. But one thing is clear, I'm not budging on this. If she can't respect my decision about my parents, then there's no point in moving forward. The wedding is hanging in the balance, and I'm not sure what our next steps are going to be. The night after I told Emma there wouldn't be a wedding if she kept insisting on inviting my parents, things escalated fast. Emma didn't say much after my ultimatum, but I could tell she was upset. She left our apartment that night, saying she needed space. I figured she'd be back the next day after cooling down, but when she didn't come home, I got a text saying she was staying at a friend's place. I didn't push for details. I thought it was better to give her some time. A few days later, things took a turn I hadn't expected. Emma had been talking to her family about our situation. That in itself wasn't surprising. I figured she'd turn to them for advice, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. Emma's parents, along with her siblings, got involved in a big way. They saw this as a family issue, and they believed that weddings were meant to bring families together, no matter the history or past conflicts. From what I gathered through bits and pieces, they thought I was being unreasonable for refusing to reconcile with my parents, especially for such a significant event. I was barely through the door one evening when Emma's mother called me, Asking if I could come over to their place for a family talk. The tone didn't leave much room for saying no, so I agreed. I assumed it would be me, Emma, and her family, and I braced myself for what was probably going to be a difficult conversation. What I didn't expect, though, was that my parents would be there too. When I walked into their living room, my parents were sitting there along with Emma and her entire family. It was clear that this wasn't just a conversation, it was an intervention. I could feel my frustration building, but I stayed calm. I had to. Emma's parents started talking first. They explained that they'd spoken to my parents and thought this whole situation was a big misunderstanding. They wanted us all to clear the air. My parents, suddenly playing the role of the remorseful and misunderstood, nodded along, agreeing that they just wanted a chance to be part of my life again, especially during such a momentous occasion. The way my parents were downplaying the years of manipulation and toxic behavior was unbelievable. They made it seem like our estrangement was just a rough patch in an otherwise normal relationship, like the past didn't matter. And Emma's family ate it up. Her parents, who have always been big on family values, kept insisting that a wedding was a time to heal old wounds, that family is everything, and that I'd regret not having my parents at the wedding. As I stood there, listening to them, it became clear that this intervention was planned. Emma's family had fully aligned themselves with my parents, believing that they were helping bring us closer as a family. They saw my resistance as a grudge I was holding on to unnecessarily. It wasn't that they were trying to be malicious, they genuinely thought they were helping, but they were missing the bigger picture. They didn't know the years of manipulation, guilt trips, and toxic behavior I'd endured. To them, this was just another family argument that could be smoothed over. After listening to their arguments, I finally spoke up. I calmly explained that this wasn't something that could just be fixed by inviting my parents to the wedding. I wasn't being petty or holding on to past grudges. I wasn't inviting my parents because their presence would only bring more stress and tension, not healing. This wasn't about forgiveness or moving forward, it was about protecting my boundaries. But it didn't seem to matter. Emma's family, especially her parents, kept pushing the idea that this was about unity. Her father even went as far as to say that by excluding my parents, I was going to set a tone for my entire marriage, one that wouldn't be about togetherness or family. It was a lot of pressure, and I could see how Emma might have been swayed by their perspective. What made it worse was how my parents sat there, nodding along, like they were the victims of my stubbornness. They apologized, of course, but it felt hollow. They didn't address any of the real issues, just vague apologies about how things had gotten complicated over the years, as if it were some natural event instead of the result of their behavior. At one point, Emma's mother turned to me and said, "This is your chance to make things right, before it's too late," but I knew better. I've been through this cycle with my parents before, their apologies followed by a return to their manipulative ways as soon as they got what they wanted. I wasn't about to fall into that trap again, not even for a wedding. I made it clear that my decision wasn't going to change. I wasn't inviting my parents, and that was final. The tension in the room was thick, and I could see the disappointment on Emma's parents' faces. They didn't understand my side, and I wasn't going to try to convince them anymore. After that, I stood up and left. There was no point in dragging it out further. Emma didn't follow me, and I wasn't sure if that was a good or bad sign. I spent the next couple of days wondering if this intervention had changed things between us in a way that couldn't be fixed. The next time Emma and I spoke, it was different. She didn't seem angry, just unsure. For the first time, she mentioned that maybe we should reconsider the wedding altogether. I could see the doubt in her eyes, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. All the pressure from her family, the intervention, and the unresolved issue of my parents had put a crack in what I thought was an unshakable relationship. I don't know what's going to happen next. The wedding is still on hold, and for the first time, I'm not sure if it's even going to happen. Emma is questioning everything, and so am I. What started as a simple argument over the guest list has spiraled into something much bigger than either of us expected. We're at a crossroads now, and I don't know which way we're going to go from here. After the intervention, things didn't just cool off. In fact, the tension between Emma and me only got worse. We tried to go back to normal, planning the wedding and talking about everyday stuff, but the issue of my parents lingered in the background, unresolved. Every now and then, Emma would bring it up, usually in passing, but each time it happened, I could feel the strain building. It wasn't like before when we'd argue about something small and move on. This felt different, heavier. Emma still believed that inviting my parents was the right thing to do. She thought it was something I needed to do, not just for the wedding, but for my own sake. She was convinced that I was holding on to past grudges and letting them ruin what could be a better future for me and for us. From her perspective, it was simple. My parents were willing to come, they had apologized at least, in her eyes, and that should be enough to let them back in. We tried to have a serious conversation about it one evening. It started off calm enough, with us sitting in the living room, discussing wedding details. But then Emma circled back to my parents, saying that she couldn't understand why I was so against letting them come. I explained everything again, how they'd manipulated me for years, how they had always found a way to control my life, and how this wasn't just about the wedding but about protecting myself from falling back into that toxic dynamic. The more I talked, the more it felt like Emma wasn't really hearing me. She kept pushing the idea that I was being too rigid, that maybe I was making this a bigger deal than it needed to be. That's when things started to spiral. What was supposed to be a conversation turned into another argument, with both of us digging in our heels. I kept repeating that my parents couldn't be a part of the wedding, and Emma kept insisting that they should be. It felt like we were going in circles, and no matter how many times I tried to explain my side, she just didn't get it. At some point during the argument, Emma dropped a bombshell I wasn't prepared for. She gave me an ultimatum. If I didn't try to mend things with my parents, she wasn't sure she could go through with the wedding. Hearing those words hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about a difference of opinion anymore. Emma was questioning whether we should even get married if I wasn't willing to invite my parents or at least try to reconcile with them. I could tell she didn't say it lightly, but it still stung. For the first time, I started to wonder if we were fundamentally incompatible. I had always known that Emma valued family, but I didn't realize just how deep that went. She genuinely believed that my refusal to include my parents in the wedding was a sign of something bigger, like I wasn't willing to grow or move on from the past. From her point of view, this was about us starting a life together, and she wanted to start it with the idea of family unity in mind. After that conversation, I spent a lot of time thinking. I didn't want to lose Emma over this, but at the same time, I couldn't see myself bending on the issue of my parents. So, I decided to try something else. I told Emma I was open to the idea of some sort of reconciliation, but not at the wedding. Maybe, I said, we could meet with my parents privately after the wedding, have a conversation, and see where things went from there. I wasn't ready to just let them waltz back into my life, but I was willing to explore the possibility of a relationship with them on my own terms, away from the pressure of a wedding. But Emma didn't agree. She thought that if I was willing to meet them afterward, why not just invite them to the wedding? To her, it didn't make sense to draw that line. She kept saying that the wedding was the perfect opportunity to mend fences and bring everyone together, and postponing that wouldn't change anything. To her, it felt like I was still holding on to something that I needed to let go of. The more we talked, the more I realized we were on opposite sides of this issue, and there didn't seem to be a middle ground. I was trying to compromise, but to Emma, it wasn't enough. She wanted more than just a conversation with my parents after the fact. She wanted them to be part of our wedding day, and I couldn't give her that. Over the next few days, things between us became more distant. We still talked, but there was an unspoken tension that hadn't been there before. It was like we were tiptoeing around the elephant in the room, both of us knowing that the issue of my parents hadn't been resolved. Every time we discussed the wedding, there was this underlying tension, and it was clear that Emma wasn't happy with the way things were going. I started to feel more isolated. I knew I was holding my ground for the right reasons, but it didn't make the situation any easier. It felt like Emma was slipping away, and I wasn't sure if there was anything I could do to stop it. Every conversation seemed to end the same way, with Emma questioning whether we were really ready to get married if we couldn't even agree on something as fundamental as family. It became clear that the wedding was in jeopardy. Emma hadn't officially called it off, but I could tell she was on the edge of making that decision. She wasn't saying it outright, but every time we talked, there was this lingering question in the air. Could we really go through with the wedding if we couldn't resolve this? By the end of the week, I felt more firm in my resolve than ever, but also more alone. I wasn't going to change my mind about my parents, and Emma wasn't going to back down either. It was a stalemate, and I had no idea what was going to happen next. Things between Emma and me had reached a breaking point. After the constant back and forth over my parents, I thought we'd at least reached an understanding, even if it was a fragile one. I made it clear that I wasn't going to invite my parents to the wedding, and while Emma didn't agree, we had both been trying to keep the peace. I had suggested meeting them after the wedding, hoping that might bridge the gap, but it still felt like we were walking on eggshells around each other. Then, everything blew up in a way I never saw coming. It was a regular Tuesday evening. I was in the bedroom, scrolling through my phone, half watching a show on TV. Emma was in the living room, and I could hear her talking on the phone. At first, I wasn't really paying attention. It sounded like she was just chatting with a friend about wedding plans. But then something caught my ear. She mentioned my parents, and I instinctively listened closer, feeling that familiar tension rising. What I heard next stopped me cold. Emma was going over details about the wedding with someone, and she mentioned confirming my parents' attendance. She talked about making sure they had a place at the reception, and even asked about seating them close to us during the ceremony. My heart started racing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Emma had not only contacted my parents behind my back, but had gone ahead and invited them to the wedding, something we had specifically agreed not to do. I stayed frozen for a moment, listening to her wrap up the call. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. When she finally hung up and came into the bedroom, I confronted her. I didn't yell or scream, but I couldn't hold back the anger and betrayal that had been building up. Emma didn't deny it. She admitted that she had invited my parents to the wedding weeks ago. She had kept it a secret, thinking that by the time the wedding came around, I'd come around too. She said she had reached out to them because she thought it was the right thing to do, for me, for our future, for our family. Hearing her admit it so casually set off a wave of anger I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. This was a complete violation of my trust. After everything we'd gone through, she had still gone behind my back, assuming that her decision was better than mine. To me, this wasn't just about the wedding guest list. It was about boundaries, about respect, and about whether or not I could trust her to understand where I was coming from. Emma defended herself, saying she was doing it because she believed it was the best way to heal the rift between me and my parents. She thought she was helping me, even though I had made it crystal clear that I didn't want them involved. To her, this wasn't a betrayal. It was her trying to fix something she thought I couldn't fix on my own. But I couldn't see it that way. All I saw was the fact that she had gone behind my back, lied about it, and involved my parents in one of the most important days of our lives without my consent. It felt like she had taken something that should have been about us and made it about my parents, about her idea of what family should look like. The fight that followed was one of the worst we've ever had. Words were thrown back and forth, and every unresolved issue we had about the wedding and my parents came spilling out. I was furious, not just at what she'd done, but at the fact that she didn't seem to understand why it hurt so much. To her, it was all about helping and doing the right thing, but to me, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. I couldn't stay there that night. I needed space to think, to cool off, and to figure out what this all meant for our relationship. I packed a bag and told Emma I was going to stay with a friend for a few days. She looked shocked, like she didn't expect things to go this far, but there was no way I could stay after everything that had happened. I left and crashed at my friend's place, trying to make sense of what was happening. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, and I wasn't sure what was left of our relationship. I kept thinking back to all the arguments we'd had about my parents, how hard I'd fought to maintain my boundaries, and how Emma had ignored everything I'd said because she thought she knew better. Over the next few days, Emma sent me a series of messages. At first, they were just updates asking me to come back home, saying we needed to talk. But as the days went on, the messages became more emotional. She apologized repeatedly, saying she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she thought she was doing what was best for us. She wanted to fix things, to find a way to move forward. But I didn't respond. I needed time to process everything, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. I couldn't even think about the wedding at this point, let alone whether or not we could move forward as a couple. The betrayal I felt was too deep, and I wasn't sure if it was something we could come back from. Staying at my friend's place gave me the space I needed to think, but it also made me realize just how serious the situation was. The wedding wasn't just postponed, it felt like it was hanging by a thread, and I didn't know if I could find it in myself to tie that thread back together. Emma's messages kept coming, but I stayed quiet. I needed to decide whether I could forgive her for what she'd done or if this was the end of our relationship. Right now, it felt like the latter. For the first time since the proposal, I wasn't sure if we were going to make it through this. Everything was up in the air, and I had no idea where we were headed next. After several days of silence, I finally went back home. I knew that we couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable conversation, and I was ready to have one last talk with Emma. My time away had given me clarity, but I wasn't sure how this conversation would end. All I knew was that we needed to address everything: our relationship, the wedding, and the fallout from her decision to invite my parents behind my back. When I walked through the door, the tension in the air was thick. Emma was sitting on the couch, waiting. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept well since I left. I didn't feel much different. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but it needed to happen. We both knew it. We sat down and started to talk. I didn't hold back. I told her how betrayed I felt, how her decision to invite my parents without my consent had crossed a line that I didn't think we could come back from. I explained that this wasn't just about the wedding anymore, it was about trust and respect. She had taken something that was deeply personal to me and made a decision for me, ignoring everything I had said about my boundaries. Emma listened quietly, and when I finished, she admitted that she had been wrong. She told me that she hadn't fully understood how deep the rift between me and my parents was, even though I had tried to explain it. She thought she was helping, trying to fix things in a way that would make our wedding day feel more complete. But now, after seeing how much pain it caused, she realized that she had made a mistake. She apologized, sincerely, and said that if it meant keeping our relationship, she was willing to disinvite my parents. She didn't want to lose me over this, and she regretted going behind my back. Hearing her say that gave me some relief, but the damage was already done. It wasn't just about the guest list anymore, it was about the trust that had been broken. The fact that she had gone behind my back and made such a huge decision without me made me question whether we truly understood each other at all. We talked for hours, going over our relationship from the very beginning. I pointed out how, in the past, we had always been able to resolve our differences by communicating openly. But this time, it felt like we were on completely different pages. The more we talked, the more I realized how fundamentally different our values around family were. Emma had grown up in a close-knit family, where conflicts were resolved quickly and everyone stuck together. I, on the other hand, had spent years setting boundaries with my parents to protect myself from their toxicity. To Emma, family meant unity and togetherness, but to me, it was a source of pain and manipulation. As the conversation went on, it became clear that our views on this weren't just different, they were incompatible. Emma wanted my parents at the wedding because to her, it symbolized healing and moving forward. But to me, it was a step backward, reopening wounds that had barely healed. Even though she was now willing to disinvite them, the fact that she had pushed so hard for something that went against my boundaries made me question whether we could truly move forward together. Eventually, we both came to the conclusion that we needed to take a step back. The wedding, which had once felt like the next natural step in our relationship, now felt like an overwhelming source of tension. We couldn't get married with this unresolved. It wasn't fair to either of us. So, we made the difficult decision to postpone the wedding indefinitely. There was no point in rushing into something when we weren't even sure if we were on the same page anymore. After we made that decision, Emma told me she was going to move in with her parents for a while. It was a temporary arrangement, just to give us both some space to think and reflect on where we stood. I didn't argue. In fact, I thought it was a good idea. We both needed time to figure out if this relationship could be saved, or if it was time to let go. Over the next few days, we started packing up some of her things. It was a strange feeling, watching her pack up the life we had built together, not knowing if she'd be back for good, or if this was the beginning of the end. There wasn't any anger or bitterness between us, just a sense of sadness and uncertainty. As Emma moved her things out, I felt conflicted. On the one hand, I still loved her, and part of me wanted to believe that we could work through this. But on the other hand, I wasn't sure if we could ever fully recover from what had happened. The trust had been shaken, and I didn't know if we could rebuild it. The space apart would give us both time to think, but I wasn't sure what conclusion we'd reach. For now, the wedding was off the table, and our relationship was in limbo. I didn't know if we would end up calling off the wedding for good, or if we'd eventually find a way to move forward. All I knew was that I needed space to figure out what I really wanted, and Emma needed time to reflect on the choices she had made. As I watched her drive away that last day, I stood there, unsure of what the future held for us. We had always been so good at solving problems together, but this time it felt like something had shifted beyond repair. The road ahead was uncertain, and for the first time I wasn't sure if we'd be walking it together or going our separate ways. I felt more resolute in my need for space, but conflicted about whether we could ever find common ground again. Only time would tell if this was a temporary break or the beginning of the end, but for now, we both needed time apart to figure it out. After a few weeks of being apart, the reality of our situation started to sink in. Emma had been staying with her parents, and during that time we hadn't really talked much. The silence between us wasn't angry or bitter, it was just empty. There were no more messages asking me to come home or to reconsider. Instead, we both seemed to be waiting for time to pass, waiting for clarity, waiting to see if either of us would come to a decision. During those weeks, I spent a lot of time reflecting. I talked to friends, trying to make sense of everything. Some of them thought I should give Emma another chance, that she had made a mistake but was willing to fix it. Others said I was right to stand my ground, that if we couldn't agree on something as fundamental as this, it was a red flag for bigger problems down the road. The more I thought about it, the clearer things became. I kept coming back to one simple truth: if we couldn't agree on something as important as my relationship with my parents, what else would we struggle with in the future? Family is one of the biggest factors in any marriage, and while Emma and I had always been good at working through our differences before, this issue felt different. It felt like the kind of disagreement that wasn't going to go away with more time or better communication. It was a fundamental divide in how we saw the world, and no matter how much we loved each other, love couldn't bridge that gap. One evening, after another long conversation with a close friend, I made my decision. I couldn't move forward with the wedding. It wasn't just about the guest list or the fallout from Emma inviting my parents behind my back. It was about trust, values, and whether or not we could truly build a life together when we saw things so differently. I realized that this issue wasn't going to be the last challenge we faced. If we couldn't find common ground on this, what other disagreements would we encounter down the road that might be just as difficult to resolve? The next day, I called Emma and asked if we could meet to talk. She agreed, and we decided to meet at a park near her parents' house, somewhere neutral. It was a crisp, clear afternoon, and as I walked toward her, I could see that she already knew what I was going to say. We sat on a bench, the conversation starting slowly. We talked about how things had been since we'd been apart, how we'd both been thinking a lot about the situation. And then I said it: I couldn't go through with the wedding. Emma didn't cry or get angry. She just nodded. I could see the sadness in her eyes, the weight of everything that had happened. She told me that she had been afraid this was coming but had been holding on to hope that we might still find a way to work things out. But deep down, I think she knew that our relationship had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. We talked for a while longer, about how we had both tried to make things work, about how much we cared for each other. There was no animosity between us, just a quiet acceptance that this chapter of our lives was coming to an end. We agreed that it was better to part ways now before we went any further, rather than trying to force something that wasn't going to work. As we said goodbye, there was a sense of finality. We hugged, but it felt different, more like a farewell than anything else. I watched her walk away, and for the first time I felt at peace with my decision. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right choice. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome certain differences, and that's what this experience had taught me. In the days that followed, I started the process of canceling the wedding. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. A few phone calls, some emails. It was surprisingly simple, considering how big of a deal it had once felt. Emma and I agreed to split the cost that had already been paid, and we handled everything as maturely as possible. I went back to my daily routine, and while there was a lingering sense of sadness, there was also relief. I knew I had stood by my principles, that I hadn't let myself get swept up in the pressure of making things work at the expense of my own boundaries. I was proud of myself for that. Looking back, I could see how easy it would have been to give in, to invite my parents, to go through with the wedding just to avoid the discomfort of breaking things off. But I knew that would have been a mistake. It would have set the tone for our entire marriage, one where my boundaries didn't matter, where I would have been forced to compromise on things that were deeply important to me. In the end, I learned a lot from this experience. I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, is necessary. I learned that love doesn't always conquer all, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself, and for someone else, is to let go. Emma and I haven't spoken much since that day in the park. There are still moments where I miss her, where I think about what might have been, but those moments pass quickly, replaced by a sense of calm knowing that I made the right decision for both of us. I hope she finds someone whose values align more closely with hers, and I hope she's able to heal from all of this. As for me, I've found peace. It wasn't the ending I expected when I proposed, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns. I may have lost a relationship, but I gained something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of myself and what I need in a partner. And for that, I'm grateful. Make sure to follow us for more amazing Reddit stories.